You and I have seen it. The North Carolina sky carried that specific pale gold shade that only hits right before something massive happens. Down at the Sterling Apex Motorsports test track, every camera, every single executive, every investor had gathered to witness what they loudly called the glorious rebirth of a racing empire. The Apex R9, a $14 million prototype. It sat under the soft launch bay lights like a polished black blade, but way in the back of the technical bay, wearing dark blue overalls heavy with dark engine grease. A quiet single father named Flynn Callahan stood there, catching a faint sound the loudest people in the room missed. Flynn was 29, built broad, with short, neat brown hair, and tired, gentle eyes that showed he had lost far more in life than he would ever talk about aloud. To the flashy new engineers at Sterling Apex, he was just another invisible mechanic on the floor. None of them realized that the slight dry knock hiding under the engine roar was the first whisper of a disaster that could wreck more than a vehicle. But the whole company, and that Flynn, with his grease-stained hands and a name completely ignored in the executive suite, was the only person in the entire building who understood. Vivian Sterling, 28, the new chief executive of the brand her late father built, stepped onto the small stage with the practiced grace of a leader who rehearsed her confident smile in mirrors. She wore a cream dress under a tailored black blazer, her chestnut hair falling loose at her shoulders. Her voice sounded perfect as she promised the wealthy room a return to glory. Behind her, the Apex R9 sat like a promise waiting to be tested. Flynn heard that knock again, sharp, subtle, dry, hiding beneath the hum like a sick heartbeat that just did not belong. He turned to a young engineer named Otis Warren and stated calmly that the car must not run. Otis stared at his tablet, saw 0 warning lights, and shrugged. Dermot Blake, the loud, proud head of engineering, a tall guy of 44 with sharp cheekbones and a brutal temper, stepped in with complete disrespect. He snapped that Flynn was hired to scrub tools, not to touch million-dollar prototypes. The raw data, he announced loudly, did not lie. But you and I know data misses quiet truths. Flynn knew an ignition map slightly out of phase with the cylinder pressure could fool every computer sensor and still blow an engine to pieces in 3 seconds flat. He completely understood the difference between the sound of a perfectly healthy machine and one that was already screaming in pain. And he realized with terrifying certainty the Apex R9 was about to be sent out to break. This is where you and I pay attention. Flynn finally moved. He stepped past Otis and 2 very shocked technicians, past the velvet ropes separating invisible mechanics from the shining prototypes, and popped the auxiliary engine panel open. With one quiet motion, he disconnected the secondary fuel line. With the other, he unclipped an ignition coupler from a race engine connector that was running dangerously hot. The massive engine coughed once, breathed a thin line of white smoke, and settled into silence. Let's watch the chaos unfold. The crowd spun around and Dermot's voice lashed across the garage. He just sabotaged the prototype vehicle. Vivian marched off the stage, flashing camera lenses tracking her every single move. She only saw a nameless mechanic with grease-stained hands standing next to a smoking car. Her mind was already coiled tight. Months of relentless pressure from a doubting corporate board had taken its toll. She instantly did the cold math her executive training demanded. This was a live PR disaster, unfolding right in front of the most crucial investors in the automotive brand's history. And a quiet man she didn't even recognize stood right at the center of it. Flynn calmly tried to explain. If you let that car run, the engine will come apart at speed. Vivian's face went rigid. He looked her directly in the eyes, his voice perfectly steady, his hands open. You can fire me later, he said. But first, please check the ignition map. Don't put the car back on the track. But the loud panic inside her own head drowned him out. She could feel the heavy stares of the board members. She heard the toxic whisper she had carried since taking over her father's CEO chair, that she was just the heir, the fragile daughter trying to fill a legendary man's shoes. And so, before the flashing cameras, wealthy investors, and a little girl clutching a worn stuffed rabbit, she made the swiftest, most brutal call of her career. You are fired, she said. Leave the testing grounds now. That little girl behind the ropes was 6-year-old Louisa Callahan, with hair the color of late afternoon wheat. Her wide, terrified eyes peeked over the stuffed rabbit she gripped against her chest. Her mother had gifted her that exact rabbit, and her mother was tragically no longer in this world. You and I know the truth. Her only steady foundation was that quiet man in blue overalls who fixed everything. Little Louisa ducked under the velvet rope and sprinted straight to her father's side. She glared up at the executive in the cream dress and spoke in the small, brave voice of a kid who knew nothing about corporate contracts but everything about her dad. He didn't break the car. My dad fixes everything that is hurt. Vivian's jaw clenched tight. She absolutely refused to look down at the young girl. Your father broke protocol, she announced. The whole room heard, and the veteran mechanics quietly lowered their eyes in silence. The quiet genius just knelt gently in front of his daughter. He softly brushed a stray tear from her cheek with the back of his thumb. "Come on, sweetheart," he whispered, keeping his voice so low that only she could hear. "Let's go. I really don't want you to remember me by this ugly moment." He unclipped his corporate badge, passing it to a security guard who couldn't even look him in the eye. Then he calmly lifted Louisa's tiny hand into his own. Without arguing once, without raising his voice. He walked her past rows of gleaming motorsport vehicles she had always been taught to admire. Think about it. He walked past the very trophies he silently built, heading out the glass corridor toward the parking lot. The little girl Louisa glanced back once. Like she couldn't grasp why this shop her dad loved had suddenly chosen to just break him down completely. Vivian just watched him walk out. She had no clue she had just fired the very mechanic who built every championship car sitting in that hallway, and that this failing brand she was trying so hard to save would in a matter of hours be saved by him alone, 3 days before the engine even knocked. You and I know guys like him. His morning started like every other inside that tiny house he rented, 20 minutes from the Sterling Apex test track. On his wall hung a framed picture of his late wife, holding a newborn Louisa wrapped up tight in a hospital blanket. They say he never stared at it for very long. Since she passed, he figured out that heavy grief is a lot easier to haul around if you just keep moving forward and never stand still. He toasted bread, cracked a couple eggs, and poured milk into a tiny blue cup. His little girl stood there, hair completely tangled, holding a stuffed rabbit under her arm, asking him the same quiet way she had been asking for almost a whole year. If he could try braiding her hair the exact way her mother always did. Flynn really tried, he always did. It always came out crooked and a bit too loose. But Louisa just giggled at it like she always did. Flynn would smile right back, quietly reminding himself of a simple truth he always held on to, that his most vital job on this earth had absolutely nothing to do with building motors. Riding in his old truck to the elementary school, Louisa drew shapes on the foggy glass, asking why he wasn't the big boss of the racing crew anymore. Like he looked in those dusty photos she dug out of a shoebox in his closet. Flynn stopped at the red light. "The absolute most important job I have," he told her, "is being your dad. Everything else is honestly just work." She nodded like that made total sense. To a 6-year-old kid who had already lost her mom, it really did. Down at Sterling Apex, we watched him move quietly through the bay, same as he had for years. He clocked in before those fancy engineers and prepped tools. I watched him listen to those motors idle the way other folks listen to music. These young automotive techs walked right past him blind. We used to joke that old Flynn was the shop's radio, permanently tuned to whatever frequency the vehicle was speaking. He never bothered correcting us. He didn't care if the new kids knew the legend he used to be. Tucked away in the break room corner, hidden right behind a stack of flashy modern trophies, hung this faded picture of a very young Flynn standing next to a bearded guy with real gentle eyes. That man was Vivian's late father. That frame gathered dust for so long that nobody in the crew even noticed it anymore. Upstairs near the executive suites, a vintage championship race car sat parked inside a massive glass display. A tiny brass plate mounted right on the pedestal read, in letters most passing guests completely ignored, "Legacy Platform by FEO." Here's the secret. No rookie engineer ever asked what those 3 initials actually stood for. Meanwhile, 2 floors up from our dirty workshop, inside a sleek corner office with giant windows overlooking the track. You and I know inheriting a giant legacy is tough. Vivian Sterling was learning it firsthand. She grew up around our engines, spending her childhood down in the pit lanes. She learned the names of our bolts way before she learned her state capitals. We'd see her on her dad's lap, listening close to the race day radio chatter. Her old man was a boss who truly believed that the true soul of a company lived in the quiet people holding it together. He built Sterling Apex on that exact truth. For 30 years it won championships and earned our deep respect. But when he died, the corporate board moved fast. Suddenly, corporate suits arrived with their fancy strategies and consultant slide decks. Cold quarterly numbers replaced his walks through our work bay. Guys got promoted for tracking spreadsheets instead of actually feeling out a torque curve. And then there was 28-year-old Vivian, highly aware of every single whisper, calling her the heiress. She learned to wear his title like heavy armor she hadn't quite earned the right to take off yet. She wasn't naturally cruel. Honestly, she was just a scared kid stuck in a role that absolutely forbade fear. She started wearing sharp dresses and structured jackets, learning the hard way that those boardroom sharks saw any softness as pure weakness. She'd practice every single sentence in the mirror before facing the press. Late at night, she studied her dad's old letters, hunting for the secret to earning our real respect. But what she actually found instead was the slow, crushing pressure of being judged daily against a racing legend whose massive shoes she couldn't fill. Dermot Blake used to be one of her dad's lieutenants. We all knew he'd waited his entire career for this exact moment. Let's look at his game plan. He knew stressed young executives hate hearing about mechanical problems. She just wanted to hear about easy fixes. So he fed her slick, confident answers every single week. And beneath those slick fixes, he buried every warning from us older mechanics who trusted a humming engine over a shiny tablet. He convinced her the sport's future was all about data, digital simulations, and ruthless executive control. He kept whispering that quiet, hard-working men like Flynn Callahan were just outdated relics. Vivian bought into it because she desperately needed to. She needed us to be the obsolete past so she could look like the brilliant future. During the big briefing the night before the launch, she stood over that giant glass table and warned the whole crew that any deviation from the approved script during the public test run meant instant termination. She spoke dead slow, locking eyes with every single person in that room. But she had absolutely no idea in that moment that she was actually building the exact trap she'd soon stumble right into. She just knew she couldn't risk another rumor or one more doubting look from investors. Another headline claiming the young heiress was completely losing her grip. Later that night, as she walked through our quiet bay, she stopped by the safety zone, where a little girl with a stuffed rabbit sat waiting for her dad to finish his late shift. Vivian almost gave her a smile. We've all let stress win before. The pressure hit her hard, and she turned away cold before that smile could ever land. The Apex R9 was built on a chassis. Our quiet guy Flynn drew those exact lines years ago, back when the suits still let him sign his name. The loudmouth new engineering team just slapped modern systems over his bones. Turbocharged engines, electronic ignition maps, smart fuel injection, real-time telemetry. On the flashy spec sheets it looked seamless. To Flynn's ear, garbage. He caught the problem for the first time 2 nights prior, right during a basic low-load test in our back bay. The engine hummed perfectly across that whole lower speed range. But let me tell you, when the load shifted and turbo spooled, there was a dry knock. So quiet you'd miss it, hiding right between 2 sensor readings. Flynn knew that exact knock. He heard it years ago, on a prototype that tore itself to pieces right on the test track. The ignition was firing just milliseconds too early for the pressure building inside that chamber. At slow speeds it meant absolutely nothing. At full throttle, loaded up, with the secondary fuel line pushed to its absolute limit, that meant a blown engine block, so he warned Otis. Otis just checked his fancy tablet, said the diagnostics looked green. Flynn quietly asked him to pull the ignition map. Otis claimed only senior engineers got access, so Flynn found Dermot. Dermot was sitting in his office, reviewing a flashy presentation slide. In crisp white letters, Apex R9 restoring the legacy. When Flynn knocked, Dermot didn't even bother standing up. Flynn explained the knock, the timing, the load curve, and the fuel heat. He warned him straight up that the car wouldn't survive a full throttle run on the track. Dermot listened the exact way an arrogant boss listens to. A background noise he had already decided to ignore. "You know the type. Flynn," he sighed, talking down to him, "you were useful 10 years ago. Today we rely entirely on data." Flynn just answered quietly, "Data only shows what the sensors measure. The knock I hear hides right between two sensors. That is the kind of quiet warning that in a healthy company would have immediately stopped a meeting. In ours, it ended his access completely. Dermot ordered us techs to keep him far away from the prototype's laptop. He smiled, telling us the floor runs better without a quiet guy second-guessing his shiny new tools." Later that night, Flynn quietly wrote down everything he heard. The exact engine speed when that faint knock finally appeared. The rising temperature of the auxiliary fuel line. The strange behavior of the ignition timing on. The race dashboard he was barely allowed to glimpse. He folded that page once, sliding it straight into his worn jacket pocket. "You and I know the quiet ones write the truth down before disaster strikes." Walking out to the dark parking lot later, Louisa grabbed his hand. "Daddy, why do you keep listening to it?" she asked. Flynn just smiled. That tight smile that never hits the eyes. "Because sometimes machines speak very softly," he told her. "If you ignore them, they'll just scream by tearing themselves to pieces. You and I are about to see just how true that warning would become." Launch morning arrived, and his babysitter bailed 20 minutes before he had to leave. Her own kid had a fever. And he'd totally missed the teacher planning day, scribbled on his kitchen calendar. He strapped Louisa into his truck, drove to the garage, and tucked her safely behind the VIP velvet rope. He quietly warned her to stay put, promised he would be right back. He kissed the top of her head and got to work. Completely unaware he was about to lose that job right in front of her. Vivian caught a glimpse of the kid just as she stepped up to the podium. Just for a split second before cameras rolled, her hard edges melted. Remembering what it was like growing up in pit lane. Perched on stacked tires, watching her dad work alongside mechanics in greasy coveralls. Then a suit tapped her arm. The memory vanished and she ignored the little girl until the absolute worst possible second. Flynn drove them home in silence. Louisa stayed quiet in the passenger seat, squeezing a stuffed rabbit under her chin. Almost 20 minutes later, she finally asked him, barely whispering, if the big bosses at the speedway thought he was a bad guy. He parked the truck on their gravel driveway and turned to face his daughter. He didn't swear at the CEO who fired him or trash the loudmouth engineers who completely ignored his warnings. He just gave his little girl the only honest answer. "People misunderstanding who you are doesn't make you bad," he said. "But you have to live right enough so someday the truth has room to stand." Once inside, he opened a hall closet she was never allowed to snoop around in. He pulled down an old metal lockbox, setting it right on the kitchen table. He opened the lid and just let his hands rest on the contents inside. Faded yellow blueprints, an early championship award bearing his real name, and letters written in Vivian's dad's own careful handwriting. He didn't call a single soul. He didn't grab the phone to shout and defend his reputation. He figured out ages ago that a man who has to announce his own worth has already lost the room entirely. The actual truth would have to emerge from the engine data, or not at all. Back at headquarters, the real truth was already starting to spill out. Vivian sat alone in a glass boardroom, reviewing that launch footage on a massive screen. Dermot stood right beside her, drafting a fake press release about some low-level mechanic violating protocol before being instantly fired. He threw around slick words like decisive and exemplary leadership. He smiled while saying all that garbage. Vivian definitely didn't. Frame by frame, she watched Flynn walk up to that race car again. And she finally spotted what her anger had totally blinded her to earlier. He wasn't panicking at all. He wasn't acting shady. He moved exactly like a top surgeon. Precise, urgent, doing a high-stakes procedure he'd mastered years ago. She rewound the security video. "You and I can see it clearly now. He wasn't destroying that engine, he was saving it. Stick with me here," she called Otis inside. The arrogant young engineer walked in looking absolutely ghost white. Under pressure, he confessed that Flynn, the quiet mechanic he ignored, had actually warned them yesterday about a strange engine knock during a low-load test. Dermot instantly tried cutting him off. But Vivian simply raised a hand, and surprisingly the noisy boardroom went completely dead silent. Otis nervously kept spilling the whole story, describing Flynn's quiet confidence, admitting he trusted flashy telemetry data over a seasoned quiet veteran who lacked a fancy motorsport job title on his shirt. While Otis was still sweating, the heavy door suddenly opened. A terrified young shop technician muttered in a shaking voice. He said the track engineers fired up the race car again, and that mystery engine knock came back much louder. Right where the quiet mechanic predicted, Vivian locked eyes with Dermot. For the first time since her old man's funeral, she finally saw past the loud charm. Standing there was just a guilty man who got caught. Archie Bennett was 62 years old. The retired chief designer had a silver beard and the deliberate walk of a guy who lived on garage floors. He flew in per Vivian's direct request, supposed to be the VIP guest for this hypercar launch. But his plane got delayed. You and I know how tense garages get. When he parked, the launch was already ruined, and a thick, ugly silence hung over the bay. He strolled right into the boardroom without even knocking. Archie listened silently for 30 seconds before catching on to the corporate drama. Then he asked the one question that shattered their illusions. "Who?" he asked, keeping his voice low and eyes freezing. "Just told me that Flynn Callahan sabotaged the race car." Dermot nervously tried to chuckle. He brushed it off as some internal HR issue, claiming it was nothing a guest should ever worry about. Archie completely ignored him. He marched past the fancy table, past Vivian, right past the door guard. He headed straight into the bay, where that broken prototype sat with its hood popped. He silently inspected the auxiliary fuel lines and ignition couplers, spotting a tiny grease smudge right where Flynn's steady hand had been working. He stared at the ruined race car for a long time, just standing in complete silence. When he finally turned back around, his tone was dead calm. "He saved this engine." Vivian asked how he could possibly know that. Archie replied without ever pulling his gaze off the damaged prototype. "Because the genius who taught me to hear that exact mechanical failure," he said, "was Flynn." The entire garage went dead silent. Vivian commanded her assistant to pull up the historic archives, those old blueprints from before her dad died. The loudmouth Dermot protested. He argued those classic files were irrelevant and totally outside scope of their investigation. But Vivian, having spent the past hour, "You and I both know the danger of loud men burying the truth by calling it irrelevant. Just drop the hammer. Open them." The big screen flooded with secrets. Chassis blueprints, cooling frameworks, hidden ignition baselines, torque distribution maps, the hidden motorsport dossier structure. Tucked in the corner of every legacy document was a quiet, careful little signature. F. Callahan, lead automotive engineer. Archie stood by the screen. Let's look closely, because he finally delivered a powerful tribute to a quiet man he had secretly admired for years. He looked at Vivian and explained Flynn was the youngest lead engineering mind in the company's history. He didn't just draft cars. This silent genius built them by hand, testing them alone on the tarmac. He listened to them run, quietly tuning their performance one cylinder at a time. He explained that every single championship trophy in the Sterling Apex lobby sat on a foundation Flynn quietly sketched before modern software even existed. He explained that when his wife passed away, Flynn begged Vivian's dad for a quiet background role, just so he could go home and raise his little girl. Her father loved Flynn like a son. He granted that humble demotion without a second thought. The HR files were quietly sealed. The loud new corporate executives never bothered checking those records. Vivian just sank slowly into the closest chair. She suddenly remembered the tiny voice of a 6-year-old girl who said, right before being escorted off the tarmac in shame, that her quiet daddy fixed whatever was broken. That sentence seemed sweet at the time. Now it crashed down like a guilty verdict. You and I know this feeling. Vivian felt it instantly. A quiet, behind closed doors apology wouldn't cut it. She had fired the man holding everything together, publicly. She let the noisy media brand him as a corporate saboteur. She let his little girl hear that brutal judgment, a child she barely even noticed during the loud chaos. The absolute truth, just like the damage, had to go public. She suspended Dermot right then and there. She ordered the PR team to freeze all outgoing statements. She summoned the board, stakeholders, arrogant engineers, and floor mechanics. And the very same journalists who filmed Flynn getting fired back into the main testing bay. Once the garage was packed, she walked to the front holding absolutely no notes. She stated three things very clearly. First, the quiet Flynn Callahan did not sabotage the Apex R9. Second, Flynn had actually stopped a massive engine blowout that, at maximum throttle, could have caused real injuries and destroyed a $14 million supercar prototype. And third, she announced that Flynn was the brilliant mastermind whose quiet hands built the technical backbone of every winning vehicle they ever made. Archie then stepped up beside her and, "Stick with me here." Archie explained the flaw with incredible patience. The tiny ignition mistiming, the backup fuel pump pushing way past its safe limit. The specific second that vibration would have triggered a total catastrophic failure. He projected the internal diagnostic system logs. He pointed to the exact timestamp when the dangerous engine mapping was uploaded into the prototype. That timestamp was logged 48 hours before the launch. The arrogant user account attached to it belonged to Dermot Blake. Dermot stammered an excuse, claimed he was just optimizing the car's performance. Archie didn't even yell. He calmly stated that optimization without proper simulation, without safety reviews or any signed paperwork, just wasn't optimization. It was pure negligence disguised as confidence. Dermot wasn't just dead wrong about the motor engineering. He broke the exact same shop protocol he'd weaponized against a quiet genius like Flynn. The wealthy investors didn't explode. They got dead quiet. That's what money men do when calculating exactly how furious they can afford to get. The board members shifted awkwardly in their fancy chairs, waiting to see Vivian's next move. But she didn't hide. She faced the executives without even blinking. "I made a decision too quickly. I trusted a title instead of the truth. And I dismissed the man who saved this car." Then she threw the old engineering blueprints up on the wall. We all watched the true design history of Sterling Apex Motorsports scroll across that screen. Every single schematic was signed in that same familiar handwriting. Us older mechanics in the back, guys who'd turned wrenches beside Flynn long before his quiet retreat to the floor, lowered our heads. I won't lie, I wiped my own eyes with my greasy wrist. You and I know the quietest guys usually hold everything together. It takes years to see them vindicated. But Flynn wasn't even there. The CEO's big apology was given to everyone except the guy who actually earned it. Staring at the empty spot on the floor where he belonged, Vivian finally understood that she still had one final job to handle. And she definitely couldn't do it hiding behind a corporate podium. She had to leave the shop. She actually drove her own car for once. She warned her personal assistant not to call his house. She punched his address into the GPS and drove 20 straight minutes through endless farmland and empty intersections, finally parking right at the edge of a gravel driveway. It was a simple one-story home with white siding and a little kid's bike on the porch. She sat frozen in her expensive car for a solid minute before opening the door. Flynn answered the front door himself. He'd swapped his dirty shop overalls for a clean, simple gray tee. He just stared at her, no surprise, no smugness, no anger. Behind him, his daughter Louisa hid in the hallway. Clutching a stuffed rabbit, she watched the mean lady from the bad day with the cautious, steady gaze of a kid who already knew grown-ups could be totally unpredictable. In her fancy tailored dress and blazer, Vivian looked completely out of place on that tiny porch. We all know corporate power looks weak facing the exact people it just hurt. So she dropped the slick corporate talk. She just told him straight up that she'd reviewed the engine data, that she'd seen his old design archives, that she finally knew what Dermot pulled, that she understood what Flynn had sacrificed, and more importantly, the terrible mess she'd made. Flynn just listened quietly. "Let's pay attention here." He asked one single question. "Did you know all of that?" He said, "Before or after my daughter heard you call me a man who broke protocol?" Our CEO didn't answer right away. She knew whatever she said was going to leave another ugly mark. Finally, she just whispered, "After." Picture this. Flynn's little girl stepped forward, staring right up at her. "Are you here to take my dad away again?" she asked. Her voice was so fragile it barely carried across the room. Vivian did the only decent thing left in her playbook. She dropped down slowly until she was right at the kid's eye level. "No," she admitted, "I came here to tell you I was completely wrong. Your dad didn't break that engine, your dad actually saved it. And I'm sorry I frightened you." The little girl stayed absolutely quiet. She turned to look at Flynn. Kids always check with their true north when they aren't sure how to feel about something. Flynn rested a quiet hand on her shoulder. He looked at Vivian and spoke without a drop of anger. He said he didn't want cash or a shiny new title to make this ugly moment just vanish. If she actually wanted him to come back, she'd have to tell the truth in front of all of us who watched him get dragged out in disgrace. His daughter needed to hear it. Us mechanics on the garage floor needed to hear it. The motorsport press had to hear it. Vivian agreed instantly. She asked him back to the bay, not as a fired worker being summoned, but as the true genius who could save that racing prototype and rescue the brand's reputation. Flynn stayed silent for a good while. He had every reason to refuse. He'd earned the absolute right to say no. He just looked down at his little girl, who was watching him so seriously. And he asked her, with a tiny smirk, if she thought he should step in. Louisa thought it over. She pulled gently on her toy rabbit. Then she said, "Daddy, if the race car is still broken, will you fix it?" Flynn cracked a faint smile. He looked back at the boss. "I don't fix engines just because people deserve it," he told her. "I fix things because it is simply the right thing to do." The next morning, you and I could feel a completely different energy. The big investors came back. The corporate board was there, the racing cameras too. Even Dermot was dragged back in, flanked by two guys from corporate security. They shoved him in the back row, forced to watch. Our garage bay was packed just like yesterday, but the whole vibe inside was completely different. You could feel a very specific kind of tension. That deep stillness you get when a massive overdue debt is finally being repaid. Flynn strolled in holding his daughter's hand. He didn't wear some fancy suit. He had on his usual dark blue work overalls, freshly washed automotive logo sitting proud on his chest. Louisa gripped his hand tight, that stuffed rabbit dangling from her arm. They walked right through the crowd of elite engineers and tense executives without rushing. And all of us, almost instinctively, just parted to let them through. Head designer Otis Warren met them halfway across the floor, no grand speech. He just admitted, in a quiet voice, that he really should have listened. Flynn just nodded. "You see, the quiet ones really hold everything together." Look, I didn't crush the young guy with a longer answer. Some lessons teach themselves if you just leave enough silence. CEO Vivian stood beside the prototype. She didn't greet me with that fake corporate warmth. She simply stepped aside, like you would for a surgeon, and let me approach the championship car. I went to work the exact way I always have. Hood up, my hands totally clean. I closed my eyes for a second, just listening to the engine bay. I completely shut off the automated tuning. I rolled the ignition map back to a baseline I wrote years ago, the same one that won us races. Then I swapped a heat sensor that had drifted way out of tolerance. I gave the test driver a nod. The Apex R9 fired up with a smooth rumble, 0 knock. No smoke at all. The driver eased onto the track. The first lap was totally clean, the second was faster. That third lap shattered the company's internal record by such a massive margin. An older engineer actually laughed out loud before quickly apologizing to everyone. When the car finally rolled to a stop, the room didn't erupt into cheers the way they were ready to yesterday. The vibe was entirely different now. You and I have seen this before. Slow, heavy applause from investors who almost traded my entire career and my kids' faith for pure carelessness. Vivian walked straight over to me and little Louisa. She didn't hide behind a fancy podium. Right there in front of everybody, she offered me the chief race engineer job. I didn't answer her right away. I told her I'd only come back on my terms. Every single technical concern raised on the floor. No matter the title, age, or background of the person speaking up, they would be heard. Nobody gets fired again without a truly honest, fair review. And Sterling Apex had to build a real support program for single parents, so that no parent ever has to make that impossible choice. The way I had to choose between being there for my kid and getting respect at work. Vivian agreed right in front of everyone. The board didn't say a word. The rich investors stayed completely silent. Honestly, a few looked relieved, like a question they were terrified to ask had finally been answered for them. We've all been there. Later, when the cameras finally left, I stood by the edge of the empty track, with Louisa riding on my shoulders. Her stuffed rabbit dangled from her hand. The Apex Arn sat quietly in the bay behind us. Vivian kept a respectful distance, content for the first time in forever to let a moment belong entirely to someone else. Louisa leaned forward, resting her chin against the top of my head. "Daddy," she asked quietly, "do they finally know you built the cars?" I just looked out at that long ribbon of dark asphalt. "Maybe," I told her. She thought about it. Then she whispered, "Are you happy?" I just held her ankles a little tighter. He reflected on those silent years holding everything together, and that brutal night the CEO fired him. Then came the morning he returned without any anger or vengeance. He remembered his late wife. Before she left, she taught this master mechanic that being kind mattered more than being right. "I am at peace," he told her, "because you finally saw that real truth never has to shout." Back in the quiet, cooling shadows of the garage bay, those championship race cars sat waiting, right where he parked them. Look, some men spend their whole lives quietly building engines the racing world forgets to honor. But you and I know, when truth finally arrives for them, it does not need revenge. It just needs to step calmly into a room, set the record straight, and let the silence handle the rest.